Hi, my name's Kymberly Louise. Thank you very much for watching Where Does Learning Go Wrong for Students with Additional Learning Needs? For people that haven't been to a Learning for All workshop before, we've been doing workshops, professional development for educators for about 6 years now, and we mostly support staff in inclusion, differentiation, anything related to wellbeing for children with additional learning needs. I have been working in this job for about 3 years. Previous to that, I was at university teaching in psychology. I'm currently teaching in the disability unit at uni, and I have about 25 years special education experience. This workshop is to give you a bit of a taster on understanding the learning system. There are many components of the learning system, and if I can explain to you some of the bits where it might go wrong, it might help you to identify for your particular students where they might be struggling. We'll start with understanding the complexity of the learning system. These are our learning outcomes for today. We'd also like to detect gaps in the learning process for specific students and also identify areas of your own understanding where you might require further training. I've provided a handout for you to be able to take notes. There's 2 tables on there. The first table is for you to identify student names and where you might start thinking that errors might be occurring in their learning process. And then the second table is for you to be able to identify training for you or any staff that you might be supporting. This is the learning process. As I said, it's multi-component. So it starts with how we actually intake information and it ends with the application of knowledge. We'll go through it one by one. With application, we're not just talking about academic application of learning, we're also talking about physical skills, motor spatial skills, etc., social skills and behaviour. So understanding consequences, understanding cause and effect, all of it is dependent on the learning system. And here's a little list of some of the things that you might see for children that are struggling somewhere in the learning system. Particularly, we'll often see children might have a difficulty in one area. So, for example, you might be working with the child that never has their jumper or their lunchbox. They can never be organised at the end of the day. Their schoolwork is erratic and all over the place. That will lead you to understand that there's something going wrong in the system and all of their learning might be impacted. Let's start with sensory input. Our bodies receive a lot of sensory information from the environment around us. So we traditionally think of the 5 senses, which we'll go through in a couple of minutes, but there are actually 7 senses. What happens then is our brain tries to determine for us if that particular information through that sense was important or if it should be filtered out. Not all of the information in our environment even makes it past that first line of defence. It doesn't always go into the sensory memory. A lot of the time our brain will say that information wasn't important and just discard it. If you've ever noticed that you're talking to a child who isn't paying any attention to what you're saying, it's quite possible that their brain has filtered your voice out and it's not even making it into sensory memory. Once the information gets into sensory memory, it's uncertain how long it can be in there, but it's only a matter of seconds. And then we're required to pay attention to that in order for us to use it. But first of all, we'll talk about the senses themselves. Sensory processing is basically the idea that our brain has to work out what to do with the information that comes in through the senses. We have 7 senses. You'll recognise sight, sound, touch, smell and taste that we're all familiar with, but there are 2 other senses that people often aren't familiar with. They have really easy to pronounce names like vestibular system and proprioceptive system. Essentially, they're higher order systems. They're things that our body really needs to be able to do well, but they are part of the sensory processing. So the vestibular system is our sense of balance and spatial orientation. You might recognise this, for example, being on the swing. You might be somebody who really loves to swing and you might swing for hours without stopping, or you might be somebody who 2 swings in and you're already feeling nauseated. That is your vestibular system at work there. The proprioceptive system is our feedback to our brain from our joints. It lets us know where our body is. Have we got all our limbs? We haven't forgotten any when we got up this morning. With the proprioceptive system, our brain is looking for feedback where our limbs are. When it doesn't get enough of that feedback, it starts to become quite distressed. So you'll recognise that in some of the children that you work with. They might like a lycra sock, for example, or a weighted blanket, and that might be because their brain is not getting enough feedback from the proprioceptive system, and so they look for that feedback. This is potentially one of the reasons why most of us like a hug. A hug feels good because it's that squeezy joint feedback. With our sensory processing, we have a point at which the information provided to us through our senses is satisfactory. So that's when we're in a regulated state. If we have too much information, we can become dysregulated. So this graphic here shows you a picture of a cup, and basically in that middle bit, when we're regulated, if our cup is full to that extent, we feel pretty good. If our cup is too full, we are dysregulated. And if our cup is too empty, we are dysregulated. What our body will do when we're dysregulated is it will try and fix itself. So let's say, for example, with hearing. If there is too much input coming in through the hearing sense and our cup is too full, then our body will try to reduce the sensation coming in through the hearing sense. So what that might mean, you might see a child who puts their hands over their ears, who starts to maybe scream or yell or become quite panicked. That's their attempt at being able to reduce the sensation coming in. On the other hand, you might be dysregulated because your cup is too empty. The sensations coming in are too low. So a child that is running around, like crazy and touching everything, etc., just might need a bit more of some filling up for their touch cup, for example. That might be then they get fiddly toys and that fills their cup up enough that they're regulated. The key point here is that if a child is not regulated, they cannot learn. And that hopefully is the key point through this whole workshop. If there is something going wrong in the learning system, the child is not able to learn, they're not able to apply learning, and they're not able to recall things that they might know from the past because their body is now focusing on what it is that they need and trying to get their needs met. These sensory cups, they work independently and also interdependently. So unfortunately, what that means for us is that it's really hard to know if they're empty in one thing, they might be full in another, or they might be regulated for all of their senses except maybe one isn't working that great. They might be really low in the sound sense and be really looking for extra stimulation there, so you'll recognise that with the child that is constantly making noises with their mouth and constantly tapping on things and doing all sorts of things that make noise, and their cup is too low at that point, but their sight cup might be too full, and so they might be struggling with the bright lights and they might be becoming quite stressed and dysregulated with the bright light. Additionally, their sound cup could be too low in the morning, and then by the time recess comes about and they've been outside and they're playing out in the yard, and then the sound cup becomes too full. So it's actually quite hard to determine from any moment what might be happening with the child. If at all possible, get your hands on an OT report for the child. There's hopefully one in the system already if they've seen an OT, or maybe one of the teaching or leadership staff could ask for OT reports from the families. If they have a disability and are on NDIS, there's a pretty good chance that there's an OT report, particularly for older children. So if you can see an OT report, it is always going to be better than using your own judgment. And they can prescribe things like a sensory diet, which are really helpful. Here are some ideas about ways that we can help children to balance sensory information. You'll notice the two graphics at the top. One is quite brightly coloured, there's lots of opportunity for movement in that space, and the other one is quite muted with low lighting, and it seems very calming. Obviously, if you have a child that you believe is too low in, say, for example, the movement or the visual cup, you might put them into that space and offer them the opportunity to play in in that really loud, bright, movement-oriented space. However, if you feel like a child is too heightened and they might need some space to calm down, then it might be a good experience for them to be in the calming space. They're just two ideas. Not very many sites have two vacant spaces that they can use, as much as that would be fantastic. So it might just be that the playground gets used for extra movement. And I've actually, in one site, the only space that we had to be able to make a sensory room was an actual literal cupboard off of the library. The library very kindly allowed us to bring students back through behind the desk and into the cupboard. The cupboard was big enough to have one of those old frames that TVs and videos used to be on, and we put one in there and a beanbag, and that would be a nice quiet space. We had a box of Feely toys and things like that in there. Sometimes you just have to make do, but obviously those two spaces are the ideal. Underneath the line, you'll see that there is just some ideas for ways of using the sensory needs in the classroom. So the first one is like a Feely box or a sensory box. This particular site called that a happy box, and the children were really involved in choosing how it looked and choosing what went in it. What was really useful about that was done at the beginning of the year. It was done as a bit of a get to know you, and every single child in the class did it. It wasn't singled out for the kids with disability. And it was really useful for staff to get to know the children and to get some indication of what might be supporting for them with sensory needs. Children that had a lot of visually pleasing items in there, staff maybe got a sense that visual sensory system might be difficult for them. So it's a really good way of getting to know the students. It's also a good tool for intervention, and I really can't stress this highly enough. Wherever possible, intervene before the student's cup gets too full or too empty. I will talk about that again in a minute. So this is a way of, if we think that a child who normally is quite touch-based hasn't had very many opportunities to touch things over the past half hour or so, we might get the box out for them so that we're not putting them in a position of becoming dysregulated. And then, of course, there's sort of being able to use it as a response. So if a child is already dysregulated, we can use their sensory box to help them calm down. Then on the side there is just a couple of ideas, the igloo, the wobbly cushion, the sensory cushion, etc. That are just small, easy things that you can use in your classroom. I very strongly encourage you to contact CERU if you haven't gone through the library already. CERU have a lot of equipment that you can have a look at, and for regional sites, it's a very good system of being able to contact them, order something online and have it sent out and being able to borrow it for a period of time. I advocate for that really strongly. If you're testing this stuff out, what you think might work for a child might not necessarily work. So we had a child in a regional school recently who really liked a lycra sock and really liked a crawl and all sorts of things. So we tried a little tunnel, and he didn't like it, was not interested, didn't go anywhere near it. If we had just purchased that outright, then that would have been a significant loss of resources for the school. And as it was, they were able to not worry about that and find something else that suited him better. This is a reminder for me and for you, wherever possible, prevent dysregulation. A child that I'm working with at the moment has quite high sensory needs, and staff were allowing him some time on the swing, but then wanted him to be able to eat lunch with his peers. So he was coming off of the swing at lunchtime, sort of at the beginning of lunchtime, so that he would have an opportunity to play. A lot of physically aggressive behaviours were occurring at lunchtime. They were trying to put in various structures and strategies around the school to try to avoid the physical aggression, but were finding it difficult. So we decided to give him more time on the swing before lunchtime and see how that helped. And within a very, very short space of time, in fact, from the first day onwards, he was no longer having issues with physical aggression at lunchtime. He was spending more time on the swing and was becoming much more regulated afterwards, and was able to go back into class and enjoy some learning activities where that had been a real struggle in the past. Wherever possible, please prevent, instead of waiting for a child to become dysregulated. This is a link for a little video for you to watch. It's a couple of kids with sensory processing disorder talking about their sensory processing disorder. It's actually really cool to just listen to it from their perspective. And they also give you some really good tips about what to look for the children in your class. And I promise you, if you watch that, you will start thinking about some of the children in your class who you didn't actually know might be having sensory issues. We pretty commonly understand that kids with autism have sensory processing difficulties, but there are many children in our class with other difficulties or with no other difficulties who have issues with sensory processing, and this video will help you to be able to spot who they might be. Another issue to think about when we're talking about the sensory information and how it interferes with learning is the issue of interoception. I know there's some really fantastic work coming out through the department recently in the last year or two, and sites are really beginning to get an understanding of interoception, so I'm not going to spend much time on it today. If it's something you're not familiar with, please put it down in your notes there as something to get more training about. I'll just give you a very brief overview now of what it is, but it's essentially our body's ability to process and feel itself and be able to kind of understand what those senses mean and how to then respond to those sensations. One example that is a sensation within the body is butterflies in your tummy. If you have butterflies in your tummy, what does that mean? It could mean you're nervous. Most people say nerves could mean you're nervous. What else could butterflies in your tummy mean? It could mean you're in love. If you've ever watched an episode of Home and Away, you probably think that butterflies in your tummy means love. You're excited because you're about to go and see the person that you're newly dating. It could mean diarrhea. For somebody who has poor interoception, it would be quite difficult for them to differentiate, is it nerves? Is it love? Is it diarrhea? And the important thing that we need to understand here is that how we respond, how we behave, is going to be completely dependent on our understanding of that physical experience. If we can't tell the difference between nerves or love or diarrhea, or can't even feel that there's butterflies in our tummy, then we're not going to be able to respond in the appropriate way. One of the important things to know with interoception is that it's not just about physical symptoms. It's not just about, can you feel your arms and your toes and things that we tend to do with the little ones when we're doing interoception. If we're asking them to self-regulate emotions, we're asking them to regulate an experience that the body is having, a feeling that the body is having, because that's what an emotion is. If they can't connect or understand what those feelings are, they are incapable of being able to self-regulate those feelings. And we are often punishing kids for not being able to self-regulate when in fact they weren't able to feel or experience or respond appropriately to the feelings that their body was having. If you'd like to learn more about interoception, there's a little YouTube video there that you can watch. The Department for Education has some fantastic resources. Interoception 101, I don't believe it's 101 anymore, I think it's 301 now. You can get up-to-date information with that. The one thing that I really, really strongly encourage, I go out to a lot of sites and usually doing behaviour support, and I find that interoception is done but not in a way that makes it accessible for student learning. So it's usually done ad hoc, it's not really part of a dedicated program, and where you're pitching your interoception support for children might not be at the level that they're requiring. The Department for Education has a tool called a sensory overview that enables you to be able to record kind of information about where the child is at. Often on that sensory overview form, teachers will have recorded that the child isn't able to recognise their own emotions, and interoception can be a really useful support if you're finding that on the sensory overview. So on your handout, if there were areas that you were thinking, as I was talking, that you were thinking for specific students, yes, I think there might be difficulties there with sensory processing or interoception, now's the time to pop that on your notes. And if there's any further training you or your staff require, and then you won't have to rely on your memory when you get to the end of the workshop. So now we'll be talking about attention. So the sensations have come into the body and the body has tried to process them. We now require being able to attend to this sensory input. So for example, your instructions in class that might have come in through a visual form or through an auditory form, we now have to be able to attend to that information. There are a few things that dictate whether or not we can pay attention well. Executive function is really, really important for you to know. If you don't understand executive function, please write that down on your notes now or when we get to the end. It is really important for you to have an understanding of this to be able to support students in their learning. Executive function has three major roles. It's responsible for our working memory. It's also responsible for cognitive flexibility and inhibitory control. I'll talk more about working memory in a minute, so I'll just skip that now and go straight to cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility is the brain's ability to be able to focus. So to be able to know this is the thing I need to focus on, not get distracted unless something is extremely distracting, but to be able to focus. But it's also responsible for the brain being able to switch between tasks. So if you're standing at the front giving instructions and they're also supposed to be looking at their notes on the table, are they able to switch between, the things that they're meant to be paying attention to? This is one of the areas that we find really difficult for students with autism, sensory processing disorder, ADHD, etc., because often what happens is that by the amount of effort that their brain requires to be able to focus on something, by the time they are focusing on that thing, it is very hard for them to switch out of that thing to something else. And they often require a lot of processing time, so quite a few seconds, sometimes a minute or more, for their brain to be able to accept and adapt to the fact that they have to change. So you'll notice this with the student that you're asking them to stop an activity and they weren't ready because they weren't finished, and the distress that that might cause them and the amount of processing time. It isn't their fault. It's not that they're not being willing to change. Their brain is just focusing a lot of energy on that task at that time, and it's actually quite hard for the brain to change and needs some processing time. Inhibitory control is the idea that our brain can control our behaviours. It can stop our behaviours. We often think of inhibitory control as being able to stop. So a child that, even though you've asked them to stop something and they keep going, that's an example of poor inhibitory control. However, inhibitory control is also responsible for our brain being able to start things. And a lot of the children that are having difficulties in class have difficulties because their brain finds it very difficult for them to be able to start something. So there's particular hormones, neurotransmitters that are involved in starting, and they just don't work properly for kids with many of the disabilities that we work with. For those students, they need a lot more help in knowing how to start and in having their anxiety reduced so that they can start. So starting and stopping are both important processes for inhibitory control. Often we are supporting children with stopping their behaviour. We're very, very rarely supporting children in starting their behaviour. So this might look like a really detailed task analysis. It might look like us highlighting for them the first instruction on a page so that they know where to start. For kids that are getting homework a little bit older and they're getting homework and they're meant to self-regulate that, being able to, for us, say this is the first thing you will do when you start your homework can be really, really helpful. Executive function abilities change over time. We start off as babies with, very little of executive function, and we become adults with, hopefully a better developed executive function. It's important to understand that when we're talking about executive function skills, we're talking about relative to peers. If a child is struggling with skills that are of a similar age or development to the rest of their peers, then that's when we start to take notice. If the child is just at the same level as their peers, then probably the things that you're pitching to them are probably okay for their age group, but for children that are behind their peers, it's quite difficult for them. So one example of a site sort of that we're working with at the moment, it's an older child, year 4, in a classroom where people sit at desks and do their work at desks, and this child is functioning at a level much lower than that, probably at a play-based level, and not able to sit and concentrate at their desks for the same length of time or for any length of time at all at the moment. And so understanding that for them, learning needs to be pitched at their developmental level in regards to their executive function. One of the things that we'll be working with that site, and if this is familiar to you and your site, is being able to provide opportunities not just for the content of their learning to be pitched at their developmental level, but the skills or strategies that you use to teach and support a child of that age, that developmental age, not their chronological age. So I often will have staff who say, oh yes, they're operating at a level 2 years below their age, but all of the strategies for teaching and the behaviour strategies, etc., are all functioned at their age and not at their developmental level. Students who have difficulty with executive function will appear to be lazy or unmotivated. This is probably an important time for me to note that the amount of energy that our brain uses to be able to learn, to be able to think and process and learn, is astronomical. So our brain uses, this is rough, 80% of our daily energy just for itself and its own functioning. So the brain uses glucose, so it will take food that we've eaten and convert what it needs to into glucose and be able to use that for neural efficiency. Is how efficient is our brain at being able to work. It's really important to know that learning is inefficient in the brain. So learning requires more neural input, more energy than any other task. Things that you can do on automatic pilot that are automatic for you now because you've previously learnt them require much less energy. For students who are behind their peers in learning, not only is the learning using more energy than things that are automatic, but they are actually using more energy than their peers just to be able to learn the same things, because if they have a disability, their executive function is usually not operating at full efficiency, and it's actually harder for them to learn. So these children are often much more fatigued physically and mentally, much earlier in the day, and what that often will result in is behavioural difficulties in the afternoon, because by then they are purely exhausted. So being able to allow them lots of rests throughout the day and not expecting them to be able to keep up with their peers is really important. Some things that impact our executive function skills: if a child has a disability, if a child is impacted by trauma. Often children with disability and children from trauma go hand in hand, but there is another way that executive function is impacted, and that is by being a teenager. Essentially, you take a dip in executive function abilities when you hit puberty, and that lasts for quite a few years and doesn't really get you back on track until early to mid-20s. You'll recognise this inhibitory control, for example, being able to stop your own behaviour. You'll see many teenagers who have trouble in being able to regulate their own behaviour, being able to know what right is right and being able to change their mind and things like that are executive function skills. So please remember that being a teenager, when you can see these difficulties or these differences in their behaviour, that also equates to difficulties and differences in learning. Teenagers are also going to have much more trouble being organised, sequencing, processing information in the brain, etc. Executive function skills need to be taught explicitly in order for them to develop and strengthen those neural pathways. So this is just basically the idea that when somebody is struggling with something and it's requiring more energy for them for learning, the more opportunities that they have for practice and for learning efficient skills is really, really important. If you can spend a large amount of your time with a child teaching them how to follow task analysis, for example, how to choose the most important thing to start with in a task, if you can help them develop those skills, you are really helping them to be able to support their executive function development. One other area where attention becomes really, really important in the learning process is this idea of central coherence. You don't need to worry about the term, just think about detail focused versus big picture focused. Some students are going to be very detail focused. They're going to focus very much on the details. It's going to be very hard for them to understand a big picture. That might cause a lot of difficulties in things like comprehension from reading. Yes, they can focus on all of the words, but being able to understand the big picture of what the text is trying to tell them can be very difficult. It can be quite hard. We think we put a worksheet in front of the students and it might have 1, 2, 3, 4, so they know where to start. But for a child with executive function difficulties, who on top of that is quite detail focused, is not necessarily going to be able to work out where to start and be able to work out from that big, large worksheet what might be required for them. Trying to get children to see the big picture of their own behaviour. Oh, if you learn this, it will be really important later, etc. Really difficult for people with weak central coherence. So autism is associated with weak central coherence, but basically anything where the executive function skills are having difficulty, there is a potential that the central coherence could be weak. There's also some students might have difficulty with being the opposite way. They might only see things in big picture, and it might be very, very difficult for them to focus on small details. They might be able to read a text fine, but their spelling might be, atrocious, for example. Just understanding where they're at helps you to work out how to present information to them. One really, really important factor in being able to pay attention is in a child's ability to be relaxed and comfortable in the environment that they're in. We've discovered in psychology that there is a fundamental need to belong. It is essentially the idea that belonging and connection is as much a human drive as is eating, sleep, etc. And our body will drive us to a state of connection with others at the level that we're happier at. So for some people, that will be a really significant high need of connection that they have, and for other people that will be a lower need, but everybody has a fundamental need to belong. The important thing to remember here is that if students are feeling disconnected and are feeling a lack of belongingness, it will impact their ability to focus on their learning. It will get in the way of attention. They will not be able to focus. This is, again, not their fault. It's not that they're not trying hard enough. It's that the brain is saying, I have a more important need to be met right now, and I cannot focus on what you're trying to tell me until this need is met. So let's talk a little bit about belongingness. The need for belongingness is thought to come from an evolutionary perspective. Basically, the idea that in the past, pretty much everything up until the last 50 to 100 years, if we did not belong to a community, if we were not safely part of a community, then our brain would understand and recognise that we were in threat, because without a safe community to belong to, we had a higher chance of death. Way back, depending on your perspectives in evolution, but way back, in caveman times, or even, far more recently in community, farming areas, if you weren't able to belong socially to a community, then you had less access to food, less access to safety, etc., etc. What happens then is our brain says, I am feeling a lack of belongingness. I am in threat mode. And it is exactly the same threat mode as your fight or flight that you see in other risky physical situations. The brain sees no difference. The same parts of the brain light up for social threats as do for physical threats. So the brain sees no difference. What that means is for a child who is feeling a lack of belongingness, their brain is at constant vigilance for threat. So you'll recognise this with teenagers who are constantly on their social media, and you'll recognise it from children from trauma who might constantly be in flight or fight mode. But what you don't necessarily understand is that students with disability also have a high level of vigilance, particularly those that are aware that they're different from their peers, those that are aware that maybe their learning is behind their peers, those that are lacking in friendship skills, can be very, very vigilant to social threat. This may be, part of the reason why a particular child might appear to be doing work, but then they hear something from across the room and they start to get angry. So-and-so said my name, or they're talking about me, or whatever. It's that vigilance from that social threat. If the fundamental need to belong is not met, it leads to decreases in health, happiness, resilience, cognitive flexibility, and ability to learn. Additionally, it can lead to increases in mental illness, behavioural issues, criminality and suicide. So it's really important that we get this right. There's lots of really good ways that you can increase belongingness in class, in your school community, and being able to provide the child with an identity that is something other than the kid with whatever disability it is that they have, or the behaviour kid, as they sometimes identify themselves, the naughty one, etc. Being able to give them another way of identifying themselves within their school community is really, really important. So one example of a boy that I was working with last year with oppositional defiance disorder was finding it really, really difficult to have meaningful relationships with students. Had some very good quality relationships with staff, others not so great, but some very good quality relationships. His behaviours were keeping him out of the classroom most of the time, and he was spending a lot of time in the garden. It would have been really, really wonderful. We didn't get the opportunity, unfortunately, the child changed schools, but it would have been really, really wonderful if we'd been able to promote with him the identity of himself as being a caretaker of the school garden, having the other children be able to see him, be able to be successful in that, maybe being able to grow some vegetables for the school, to be able to sell, etc., would have been really, really good. And that's the direction that the school was heading in, which is exciting. Luckily, to satisfy the need for belonging, all that's required is frequent positive interactions with the same individuals, that is you, with the staff. So they can have frequent positive interactions with you, and that can help satisfy their belongingness need. One of the really important bits is that it needs to be a reciprocal relationship. So they need to be able to give back. Not forced to give back. It's not I'll do this for you if you do that for me kind of scenario, but just provided with opportunities where they get to be a meaningful member within their community. As I mentioned briefly before, if somebody is in fight, flight, freeze or flop response, which we usually call fight or flight response, then they are not going to be able to pay attention to learning. It is impossible. Their brain will not let them. An anecdote or a little analogy I like to use, if I'm standing in the middle of the jungle and I've got a tiger coming at me and my body is making a split decision about if I'm going to fight or flight, and then my teacher hands me a math worksheet, I can pretty much guarantee you I will not be focusing on the math at that point. So if a child is in fight or flight mode through to trauma or a lack of belongingness, they will not be able to learn. We must be able to support them in that feeling before we can expect them to learn. Here's your opportunity. If you notice, as I was talking, any of the things that you maybe are unsure about with your students, that you notice might be a difficulty with your students, and executive function, belongingness or trauma, please make a note of it now on your note. And if there's any areas that you would like further training on, it might be a good opportunity to write that down now. Everything so far we've talked about has been the body and brain's ability to allow information to get into your working memory. Working memory is what we used to call short-term memory. It's that really brief part of the memory system where information just sort of decides whether or not it goes into long-term. They've changed the name to working memory because they have an understanding now that it is more than just a storage place. It actually works to decide what we need to do with this bit of information in order to then be able to act on it. The working memory is made up of two components. It is made up of the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. So I'll just explain them briefly. The phonological loop is any information that comes into the brain in a phonological manner. So it could be written or auditory phonological information. The visuospatial sketchpad is basically what it sounds like, anything that comes into the brain that is visual in nature and related to space. Our working memory can process both of those things at once. I'm really sorry to tell you, but if you believed that you were a really good multitasker, it's not true. Our brain cannot actually do two things at once. If you are listening to me as you're writing something down, your brain is not multitasking, it is switch tasking. It is going backwards and forwards between the words that I'm saying and the words that you're writing down. It cannot do them both at once. The only exception to the brain's rule of only being able to do one thing at a time is that it can process phonological information and visual information at the same time. They're two separate systems. It can do them both at the same time. This is really, really important for you to know, because children that have issues with the input of phonological information, which is basically any child with a disability, any child in a trauma situation, any child who hasn't had enough sleep last night, any child who is stressed or worried, any child who is feeling disconnected from their peers, all of those children will be having issues with processing phonological information compared to their peers or compared to what they might normally on a different day. But that can be supported by giving them visual information at the same time. So we'll talk about that a little more in a minute. Our working memory lasts for about 15 to 30 seconds. So that just means it can hold a piece of information in there and work out, try and decide what to do with it over the space of 15 to 30 seconds. That's for neurotypical adults on an average day. If you've had less sleep the night before, then potentially your working memory might be reduced. If you're in a stressful situation, your working memory might be increased. You're lucky that we're doing this over a webinar, because if you had been standing in front of me at the expo, I'd now be making you do an activity where we tested your working memory. The digit span is essentially how many pieces of information we can store in our working memory and manipulate in order to decide what to do with it. So you may have heard the digit span. It is 7 plus or minus 2, so anything between 5 pieces of information and 9, and that is for neurotypical adults on an average day. A child with an intellectual disability is likely to have a 3 to 10 second working memory and a digit span of 2 to 3 items. If you think about the last set of instructions you gave to your class, how many bits of information were in that one instruction? In all likelihood, it was more than 2 or 3, which meant a child with an intellectual disability in your class would not have been able to understand. They wouldn't have had the working memory capacity to be able to manipulate that information, and it would have been lost, discarded. Children with disability generally range anywhere from that 2 to 3 up to the adult 7 plus or minus 2. And again, it's dependent on it being a good day, an average day, a bad day, etc. So it's very important to know the working memory capacity of the children in your class. If you've got a child who is struggling compared to their peers, who has a disability, then you can actually do a working memory activity with them to be able to find out their digit span. If you're interested, you can get in touch with me and I'll be able to talk you through it. It's a little bit hard to just explain sort of briefly here. It's better if you have that modelled for you. Cognitive load is the idea that the working memory has a limited capacity, and anything over and above that capacity is going to be too heavy a load for the working memory, and it will discard all of the information that it's been trying to manipulate. So we try to reduce cognitive load by ensuring that the information presented to them fits within their working memory capacity. An example of that would be making sure that your instructions are very short and have sort of 1, maybe 2 instructions at a time with pauses in between so that the child has the opportunity to process that. But cognitive load is also really important for their visual worksheets or written worksheets or book work. If you have very kindly and lovingly put lots of pictures on the page or maybe some coloured borders or things like that, then the child will be trying to attend to all of those and may have a lot of difficulty in working out what parts it's meant to be working with. Trying to reduce any extraneous or unimportant bits of information from a worksheet is really, really important. One thing I often do is, instead of giving a child a full worksheet, I will get a pair of scissors and cut off point number 1 on that worksheet. The child goes away, does that, comes back to me and exchanges it for point number 2 when they're finished, etc. That's one way of reducing cognitive load. It's just really important for you to understand that the work or the instructions or the environment that the child is in has the unfortunate ability to reduce their cognitive load ability at any given time. Now would be an opportunity for you to write down if you thought that investigating your students' working memory or cognitive load capacities might be important. If you're unsure how to do that, then further training for you. Once information has gone into the working memory, it needs to encode that into long-term memory, and then it gets retrieved back out again. Long-term memory used to be the idea, people used to think that it was like a file cabinet or a bookshelf, and information that you put into it sat in there nicely waiting for you before you pulled it out again. Long-term memory does not operate as a bookshelf. The books that you put in are very different to the books that you pull out, and we'll talk about that now. Long-term memory does also not operate as a series of pictures or videos in your head. If you can shut your eyes and visualise a memory, it is wrong. Let me explain. The long-term memory is made up of three processes. It encodes information, it stores information, it then allows you or supports you in retrieving that information when you need it, and it also has a process of forgetting, which is very important. Encoding and retrieval can unfortunately be impacted by interference. This is basically just anything that can accidentally interfere with how the memory is encoded or retrieved that changes the memory. You may have a friend who, when they tell a story, you heard them tell the story for the first time 5 years ago, and you've heard them tell it again recently, and you've noticed just how much the story has changed. Quite possibly, they don't realise the changes. Quite possibly, they think they're telling the story of the same memory that you heard 5 years ago, when in actual fact, their memory has changed. You may also recognise this from your latest argument with a loved one or a family member, where your version of the event is quite different to their version of the event. You're sure you're right, they're sure you're right. Probably both of you have had interference in your encoding or retrieval. The more we access a memory, the more changes happen to the memory. So that old game, now these days it's called the telephone game, where one person sits on one end and says something and it just gets changed and changed and changed. The more people are involved, the more the message gets changed. That's the same with the memory. So the more we access a memory, the more changes the memory has. If we don't access a memory very often, then it gets degraded. Things that often distort memories are when we mix it up with other events. When it has come from our imagination, there's a lot of really cool research that shows that you can imagine something and then later on believe it was a memory. We often know false memory syndrome is quite prevalent a few years ago in psychiatric care, that people were asked to sort of imagine or think about things or think back to their past and unfortunately created false memories. Our encoding and retrieval is also impacted by how we wished it would happen. Oftentimes we come out as the victor in an argument because that's how we wished it had been. Purposeful forgetting, so I guess some people might call that denial. Sometimes we forget things on purpose because it was quite difficult for us, or we choose not to think about it because it was quite difficult for us, and that unfortunately impacts the distortion. We're also influenced by how other people perceived the event. My husband, very lovely man, but he often takes credit for my ideas, and that's because he has remembered them as being his ideas, even though it was something that I said to him. Dreaming happens in a similar way to imagination. We can dream something and not be able to identify that in our brain as being a memory rather than a dream. And emotions are very impactful on distortions. The more dysregulated our emotions are, the less we can trust the memory of that event, in both encoding the event and the emotional state we have when we're retrieving the event. This is where memories decay. If they're left in storage for a long time without being regularly accessed, then they can decay and some forgetting happens. However, we're stuck then in a catch-22 because the more we retrieve event, the more it distorts. It's very difficult to be able to rely on memories from our long-term memory because they either have been distorted through constant retrieval or they have been forgotten. One of the things that we rely on for memory is rote learning, and I know that there are a lot of difficulties or discussions around whether or not rote learning is appropriate or whether or not we'd be looking at knowledge construction. For the purposes of this, it's important to understand that both have a place. Rote learning gives us the information to work with, and then knowledge construction allows us to apply the information in useful contexts. From a brain-based memory perspective, rote learning is important to give us that foundational knowledge. We cannot manipulate that knowledge and be able to apply it in new areas unless we have a strong foundation in our memory. There are a lot of tools that we can use and resources that we have available to us to strengthen our memory. One area that you might want to put down in your training or investigation section of your notes is the learning scientists. They are a really good introduction to memory strengthening supports or information knowledge strengthening supports for students. For example, spaced practice is the idea that we learn something once and then we have a little bit of a break from it, and then we learn it again, and then we have a bit of a longer break, and then we learn it again. And that is our best way of encoding and retrieving strong memories that haven't been overly distorted in our learning. Why does this work? What does help memory function is really, really important to know, but it's also really important to know what doesn't improve memory function. Sometimes schools have spent a lot of money on tools that they are hopeful that will work, that are supposedly evidence-based. What we have found from memory enhancing resources is that they will enhance the memory of that one thing that you are training on, and they unfortunately do not have a generalised ability to increase memory capacity. There isn't really anything that can increase memory capacity. The memory that you've got is the one that you're stuck with, and so it's really important to teach children strategies around being able to support their own memory capacity. Teaching them how to use the calendar in their phone, teaching them how to take notes, teaching them how to write and then refer back to lists are all equally, if not more important than the assignment itself that you're giving them. The things that do help improve memory are sleep, rest, recreation, building on other knowledge, and building on knowledge in multiple ways. Some people talk about fish oil tablets. There is no evidence to support that, but there is also no evidence against it at this point, so that one is still out. Building on knowledge in multiple ways is really, really important, particularly for children with a disability. We really strongly encourage that initial training of a new skill or a new piece of information happens in a one-to-one context where somebody can be supporting them, not necessarily one-to-one as in withdrawal, but somebody supporting them directly to learn that skill. And then over time, gradually generalising that to other domains. So other classrooms with other staff members, etc. Children with disability often have a lot of difficulty in generalising information. Their brain takes that little bit of information that they learned, sticks it into a compartment with the label of that class on it, and then doesn't know to retrieve it in other situations. So helping them to be able to retrieve information in multiple ways is really important for memory function. If there was anything there from long-term memory, particularly strategies in supporting coding, retrieval, spaced practice, etc., then please take the time now to write that down. The learning system up until now, if there are difficulties in the learning system to this point, the child is likely to have various difficulties. So have a little read of that list and think about the students in your class. Once the learning has been input through the senses, has arrived in the sensory memory, has been paid attention to, gone to the working memory and been processed in the working memory, then gone to the long-term memory and been encoded or retrieved from the long-term memory, a decision then needs to be made by the student, whether it's a conscious or an unconscious decision, needs to be made by the student about acting on. So decision and application is where the child then takes knowledge that they have learnt and is able to act on that knowledge. The brain makes decisions for us, about what to do with knowledge at any given time. One of the ways that the brain will decide what to do with knowledge is as part of a behavioural system. If our needs are not being met in a variety of other ways, then the brain will decide, instead of acting on that bit of information that we're trying to teach them or that they're supposed to be learning, it will instead look to have their need met in other ways. The learning process could have been working very successfully up till now, but the application of that knowledge won't work because there is something else going on in the child's life that is impacting their ability to act on that knowledge. In the handouts, I've provided you with an ABCF chart. This is a way for you to learn what might be happening with the child that might be causing behaviours to occur that are impacting their ability to learn. One of the most common difficulties that we get asked to come in and consult with is work avoidance. Yes, you also get your difficulties in other more noticeable or difficult behaviours to manage in class, but work avoidance is one of teachers' biggest complaints to us. This is still a useful tool to be able to determine work avoidance. We might be able to see patterns in what types of tasks the child is avoiding or anything else, particularly in application of knowledge. You'll often get a child who refuses to do work. We might be able to see from this sheet what might be happening. Just a brief note, Learning for All, we do education consultancy. Sometimes if you collected all of this data and aren't sure what to do with it, you can get in touch with us. One important thing that gets in the way of decision making about learning is whether or not the child is able to regulate their own emotions. Many of you have seen the Flip the Lid. You're welcome to look it up, put it in your training notes if you need to, if you haven't spent some time with Flip the Lid. But it's basically the idea that if our emotions are dysregulated, the parts of our brain that are required for applying knowledge are not active at that time. And so we need to be able to get the child regulated again to be able to apply knowledge. One of the biggest errors that we see in schools of people working with children with disability is that they try and teach the child why that behaviour was unacceptable at a time that the child is still dysregulated. If the child is dysregulated, they will not be able to learn from the consequences of that behaviour. And in fact, you're setting them and yourselves up to fail if you're hoping that they will learn from that. It's much better to wait till they're regulated, support them in becoming regulated, and then talk through the behaviour at a later date. Understanding cause and effect makes a big impact in our decision-making of behaviour. We know that children with disability and children from trauma all have difficulty understanding cause and effect. No matter how many times you tell them, if you do that, the consequences will be, it can actually be quite hard for them to make that connection. If they don't understand that, they won't be able to make a decision based on potential consequences, and chances are that their decisions for behaviour will be made on other things other than an understanding of what the consequences will be. Another thing that impacts decision making in whether or not to apply learning or apply knowledge is if a student feels that success is not achievable. Teachers often say to me, but I have a very positive classroom, or I, really am very encouraging. That is very different than a child feeling like something is achievable. What you feel as being the appropriate supports in place may not necessarily be what the child is feeling confident in being able to apply in their work. Sometimes the point of guaranteed success or errorless learning is really, really important to do with children. So the point of guaranteed success is just basically the idea that on any given day, just an average day, what is the child likely to be able to do in this activity? Is it 2 minutes of work? Is it something at the complexity of a 2-syllable word, not 3, etc.? What are they capable of doing on any given day? Giving them work at that level so that they can feel like they've achieved, and then gradually and slowly building up from that level will help the child feel like success is achievable and be more willing to apply the learning that they've just spent all of that time trying to gain. Another thing that impacts decision making is the idea of extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards. Rewards don't necessarily mean the gold star that you get on your star chart or the pencil that you've earned with the fluffy thing on the end. Rewards mean what is it about that activity or the outcomes of that activity that is rewarding for the child. Something that is extrinsically rewarding is something that is given to you or that you earn because of the activity that you do. An example for that might be I'll run really fast in the race so that I can win the ribbon at the end. An intrinsic reward is something that you gain from having done the activity itself. So running in the race because you really enjoy running, not because you're hoping to get a ribbon out of it at the end. A lot of people don't like the idea of extrinsic rewards for children. They worry that they're turning learning into something that is not motivating in its own case. For a lot of children, particularly with disability, learning is not an enjoyable experience, and to be able to engage in learning, there may be a need for some extrinsic support. It doesn't have to be a prize or something unrelated to the activity. It's often praise. It doesn't have to necessarily be iPad time, but something like that might help them regulate for future learning. Developing strong extrinsic rewards can actually be quite tricky to do, but it is worth having a go and trying, because what often happens is children will work for the extrinsic reward in the short term, but then as they gain success with the learning based on everything else that you're going to apply from having listened to me today, then the learning becomes intrinsically rewarding. And when the intrinsic rewards take over, so that feeling of satisfaction, that feeling of pride, then the child no longer has to rely on extrinsic supports. If extrinsic supports are in place, a fading plan is very important. How are we going to get intrinsic enjoyment for the child so that extrinsic rewards are no longer necessary? Being able to support children to make good decisions for behaviour is actually a really difficult and complicated process. At Learning for All, we've developed the 7-step PBS system where we introduce positive behaviour support ideas and we do coaching. So if any of this is of interest to you but you're not entirely sure how to apply it, we come and do coaching and support you in being able to adapt your practice in order to support children with disability. Areas for investigation for specific students. If you've got students who are having difficulty with self-regulation, that's that flip the lid, being able to keep their emotions regulated in order to be able to make appropriate decisions. If you're having students who are having difficulties with goal setting, they may not care about the work that they're getting or want to try for the work that they're getting because the goals are maybe not achievable for them, or if they're struggling with motivation. Positive behaviour support techniques can really help you. So far we've looked at the learning system, everything up until including the application of knowledge that we have learnt. Even if everything has gone right up until now, the child has taken information in through their senses, it was retained in the sensoring memory, they were able to pay attention to it, it went into working memory and was manipulated, a decision to store it in long-term memory, it's been retrieved back, and then the child was able to make appropriate decisions about how to apply that. There are still issues that impact the successful application of all of that learning. There are some physiological characteristics that will affect the child's ability to apply that. Sleep patterns, medication is a big one. Impairments to activation of the reward centres of the brain. For some students, they're operating at quite a low chemical level of the reward centres, so the reward centres are not receiving appropriate input or appropriate activation, and so the child will seek ways of having that reward centre be activated. You might recognise that in the child who kicks or hits or spits or something and laughs. That feeling that they're getting of being rewarded by that feels good to them. That same child, you might see another time they fall over, a friend, a peer falls over and hurts themselves, and your child will go up and put their hand around them and say, "Are you okay?" And you can't understand how there's sort of empathy in one situation and not in another. Sometimes that is because the child is seeking ways of activating the reward centre of the brain. So us being able to understand what they're doing in order to activate the reward centres of the brain and how we can instead support them in being able to do that appropriately might be really useful. There are a lot of physical characteristics that impact the child's ability to apply knowledge. Hypertonia is weak muscles, lax ligaments, the ability to be able to, for example, sit up at a table for long periods of time, or handle a long distance between the classroom and the play equipment, or spend a lot of time on the play equipment and then come off and still have strength to be able to sit at their desk in the afternoon. Depth perception, limb and core strength, etc., they can all impact how strenuously the child is needing to stay awake and alert and motivated and physically okay at school, and how that's then going to tire them throughout the day. There are some students I know who have quite stressful mornings. Getting ready for school and getting to school can be quite stressful. For those students, it's going to be very difficult for them to attend without rest. For them, being able to apply the knowledge that they've learned about behaviour and about learning, it's going to be really important for us to support them physically. I often find that we're asked to work with staff who have a student with a disability in their class, and there are things about that student's disability that they're not aware of and don't understand. It's really, really important that you spend some time looking into what are the impacts of that disability on that student's learning, but also the physical characteristics. We frequently get asked to support students who have Down syndrome. One of the first questions that we will ask staff is, do they have sleep apnea? And staff will invariably say, "I don't know." We don't know the exact number, but somewhere between 50 and 75% of children with Down syndrome have sleep apnea, yet staff very regularly are aware of that. So it's really important that you look into what might be the impact of that disability on that child. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. If there's anything that you want to get in touch, if you have any questions about anything that wasn't clear, then please feel free to email me at Learning for All, so klouise@learningforall.com.au, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in person at next year's Expo.